This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hey there, this is Alida, and I wanted to let you know that this is our anniversary episode. Storyworks Roundtable has been a podcast for a full year. And we were in existence before that as a video-only show. So we are very excited. We did not pull out party hats or noisemakers, which might be for the best here. And in honor of this momentous occasion, our first birthday, we've put a couple of donate buttons on the website at storyworkspodcast.com. So if you feel like you've learned anything about craft from us, or like we're a part of your community of writers, consider making a donation. Honestly, no amount is too small, and the money will offset the costs of production, hosting, and distributing the podcast. All right, without further ado, here's this week's show on keeping a community of writers. Welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Tonight, Robert and I are joined by MG Herron, an independent science fiction and fantasy novelist. Born in Limestone, Maine, USA in 1988 as Matthew Gilbert Herron, he was a reader from a young age and a world traveler as soon as he could walk. It's been his life's passion to seek new adventures wherever he goes. After majoring in English Lit at McMaster University, Matt promptly fell off the grid to travel throughout Europe and India. He's also worked as a whitewater rafting guide on the Yellowstone River, swam in a Mayan, is it cenote?
Cenote, yeah.
Cenote, and climbed sandstone towers in southern Germany. When he began writing professionally in 2012, Matt made his way to Austin, Texas, where he now lives with his wife, Shelley, and their dog, Elsa, in addition to publishing books and traveling as much as he can. Matt works with tech startups across the U.S. as a content strategist. Learn more about Matt and join MG Herron's Sci-Fi Fantasy Book Club at mgherron.com. And of course, many of you must know Matt. Remember him from the show. He was one of our original co-hosts here at the Roundtable, back before we went podcast when we were video only. So welcome back, Matt. We're glad to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And congrats on the podcast. How long has that been going?
A year, actually. This, in fact, is our anniversary episode. So cool. How timely. It's serendipitous that you're back here with us for the anniversary. And speaking of 1 year of doing a podcast, tonight we are going to talk about keeping the company of other writers and how that has benefited us and shaped our journey as authors. So I'm just going to throw that out there to the to the table. Was there ever a time when you didn't have author friends, when you were, working in isolation, felt all alone as a writer? Maybe the weird guy at parties nobody could relate to.
Yeah. I guess it's always awkward when people, before you meet other writers or before you've published something and people are like, oh, so what do you write? And you have to go, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Nothing, I'm writing stuff, but none of it's published yet,
That's right. Yeah.
I didn't really publish anything until I'd met other writers. I think it was the community that kind of catapulted me into that direction. So that was, a big deal for me.
Yeah, I'd have to say the same. I think it was only really, we came into publishing from my wife's yoga products, and really came into it from internet marketing as opposed to from anybody's desire to particularly be an author. Although I've been a voracious reader all my life and just thought I couldn't be an author because I could never write as magnificent as that. But we became very successful in nonfiction, and we did direct marketing. In other words, we did nothing electronic. We were back in 2006, creating hardcover producing thousands of books out of China, shipping them to the US, doing direct shipping. And, in 10 years, things have changed massively. And my wife Gabrielle sort of was late to the Kindle revolution, but we did get on the. This is going to sound pretty hacky, and it's not because the books are not like that. But we did get onto the recipe book wagon, and she did really, really well with a couple of books. They still sell reasonably well, and it made me think. And at the time, of course, being used to being online for donkey's years, I was used to researching things, and I found all these author groups, and started listening to all the podcasts. Beginning with probably Joe Penn and the SPP boys, and then finding as many as you can. As you do, you consume everything, and going on that steep learning curve. And I thought I couldn't write fiction. Like I said before, I just didn't think I was up to it. So I started trying to write nonfiction because I had probably 2 decades of experience as a business consultant. I've got a lot of content I could repurpose, and I couldn't get passionate about it. I just found it really hard.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I'll try my hand at fiction, and that was back in early 2013. And I think I wouldn't have done that without the support of the author community and seeing other people being successful. And I think that in traditional publishing, that kind of doesn't exist in the same mass market sense. I mean, obviously there are lots of authors who know one another, who act as friends. The independent sort of, what grew out of self-publishing, what we call now the indie community, I think is extraordinarily powerful at raising each other up. I mean, it has its moments.
Yeah, that's interesting. Was your journey through the digital venues as well, Matt, or did you start with the more traditional sort of community?
I think I started trying to get short stories published traditionally first, and I'm not necessarily the most patient person, and so I gave up on that pretty quickly. And then I was like, well, what's this self-publishing thing? And that was also about like 2013, 2014, and that's when I started exploring indie publishing. And how it happened for me was I started a meetup in town because there was no indie author meetup.
Okay.
And it's still running. It's run by volunteers. I go to a few meetings a year, and it's 1,000 people now in town.
Wow.
So that's kind of how I first got into it, and that was really my my master's degree in indie publishing was through this group, rubbing shoulders with other people. And I always like to think that art is always contextual, right? No matter what art it is, it's contextual to the community or to the society as a whole. And I feel like I've always benefited from being around other writers, from seeing how they work. Talking with them about story has really honed my understanding of story. And, so I think it's essential. I don't think you could produce good work in isolation, really.
Yeah, I would agree.
It shortens the feedback loop tremendously, doesn't it? And,
right.
I interestingly, sort of, how these loops sort of close. I saw one of your meetup videos because, it's my famous Michelangelo video.
Right, yeah.
And
the accidental viral video.
Exactly. And that talk of his is all about short circuiting the feedback loop and that's really hard to do, I think, in the trad world. It just doesn't really exist.
Well, I mean, in the
about this in the sorry I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I don't know if he talks about this in the talk, but one of the things that Michael was really good at was building his own community. One of the reasons he was able to shorten the feedback loop is because he got other writers involved in his reading, in his editing, and they were the people who told him, like, hey man, you should probably use an editor, hey, maybe you shouldn't do things like this. And that's how he built it. Was he first built and I've talked to Michael about this. He started because he already knew Facebook groups, and so he was like, well, why don't I just start a Facebook group with these other writers? And that's kind of what catapulted his career.
Now it's got 21,000 people in it.
Yeah, it's a little too much for me now.
It's crazy now.
People, it's too much noise, but it's a very passionate group of people, and they all follow his theory, the 20 books theory.
Yeah, so sorry, Alida. Yeah, you were going to say...
Yeah, well, the, traditional community has been around far longer than the digital community has. So back in the day of, sending a printed manuscript and a self-addressed stamped envelope for a reply when you wanted to get something published.
Right.
There were writers' groups, and you just had to dig a little harder to find them because they weren't on Facebook or, Meetup or whatever. So I belonged to writers' groups many years ago, probably 15 to 20 years ago. And that was the writers' community you had. That was the only kind of option you had until you took workshops, community ed, or places like the Loft here in the Twin Cities, and you met other writers. And then, of course, going to school, getting the MFA. That's where community sort of gets bumped up. You kind of 10x your community because you really find writers you can relate to when you go through the learning process together in the MFA program, and you're at the same skill level, and it's, you meet each other by chance, but you're in that sort of like pressure cooker of the education system and the productivity, and then you're learning the same vocab and the language, and you're all kind of bringing it. So I have that sort of community in my past, and then friends still who are in my present, and then this digital thing as well, which is maybe my primary source of community today. Everyone's so busy, it's a lot easier to just get online than to schedule things. What are the pros and cons of digital versus face-to-face that you've found?
I always like the face-to-face interaction, but I guess, if you can't find that, digital is a good fallback, but there's nothing like talking to people face-to-face. It's like online, you only get 80% or maybe 60% of what people are saying because the body language isn't there. So I was like, if you can, meet people in person, and a lot of writers now at least are digital most of the time, and then they'll go to a conference or something to get the face-to-face interaction. That's one of the reasons that writers' conferences are great, not because you're going to find a publisher there or because you're going to necessarily learn stuff. A lot of the writers' conferences are geared towards the beginner in a lot of ways, but the advanced writers still go because they want that interaction with other writers. They want the community aspect of it. So it's super valuable, even if you're not like super jazzed about any of the topics or any of the talks or the speakers. It might be worth going just so that you can, build your community. And then once you establish that connection, especially if you do it in person first, it's easier to maintain it online. Whereas establishing it online first is much harder. And I've made a lot of friends online over the years, but you need to have something in common that binds you together. Whereas if you meet somebody in person first, that could be the thing that binds you together.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and so true. I think it's worth emphasizing that as a beginning writer, you might go to a conference for the lectures and for the kind of education takeaways. And then as a more advanced writer, you go for the networking piece of it. And you see this at AWP, the academic conference, where the writers who are the teachers and the presenters don't attend any of the workshops. They just go to the conference so they can go hang out together outside of the conference.
It's all about gathering at the bar afterwards, right? Not necessarily the actual presentation.
It's about the events.
Well, and a lot of these online communities are starting to build in-person conferences, right? Like I think this weekend, the Sell More Book Show guys had their first conference, or the Smarter Artist Summit that happens in Austin. I think they've done it for 3 or 4 years now. I went to the first one, but they started, with the podcast, and the eventual evolution of it was to a conference, which is interesting, right?
Right.
Because digital first, it eventually leads to the in-person interaction.
People can't resist getting together in person eventually. That's right.
And even though writers are introverts and they don't like to be, around people too much, it's still worth doing because there's so much value in it.
Well, it's a human thing anyway. I mean, otherwise, why would we all collect in cities? It's just
Right.
something that we gravitate towards one another eventually when there's some sense of like-mindedness.
Right.
And I wanted to pick up on a couple of things as well. So I didn't mean to I realised that what I said could sound a little insulting, that the people in the trad world don't get that fast feedback loop. It happens in a different way.
Right, exactly.
Obviously, and it's interesting because listening to your path, Alida, you can hear where I think craft first is obviously the way that path works. And with the indie world, the short feedback loop, I think, is actually very business focused for many. Where it's the whole write, publish, repeat mentality. And I think in general that's a good thing, but it obviously must be very frustrating from an editor's point of view, for example, because you see work that, let's say, had it gone through the traditional channels, probably would never have made it. And yet Michael Anderley's point is, who cares? You find the readers and they'll tell you where things need to improve. Find other writers, they'll tell you where things to improve. So it's kind of really different. And I think those two spectrums sometimes butt heads as well. And that's kind of interesting, I think, to be in this very vibrant community and experiencing those different points of view. And the last to pick up on as well is that, as Matt said, if it's just text-based, you just miss a whole load of stuff, and you see these things misconstrued on Facebook or in other forums, and it's sad because you think that whole argument could have just been, it would never have happened if it had been in person. But look what we're doing here. I'm in Australia, you guys are in the US, where we're speaking face-to-face. It's not quite as good, but it's amazing what you can do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it is amazing. Video teleconferencing technology just, makes so much of what I do possible as a developmental editor. I can have clients anywhere in the world, and as long as they're working in English, I can work with them. So, and the face-to-face piece that, it's not so much community when it's one-on-one, but still, even though it's not full body language or, picking up on energy, like presence type stuff, it's still looking at each other's eyes, if not into them. And you see when someone smiles, you get the intonation and the inflection that you don't get in a text exchange, which just makes a huge difference. And then that feedback loop we were talking about, it's instantaneous. So if I say something about a person's writing that they might not get completely, or it might seem critical more so than constructive just in text, flat text on the page, you instantly get that, well, what do you mean? Okay, let's expand on that. Let's go deeper into it. And that's a huge part. The feedback loop is just such a huge part of community, I think, for all of us. And when we help other writers, say by explaining something, we're teaching ourselves as well, like having to articulate that idea.
Yes.
Really 100%. Helps us grow.
There's some things that are hard to discuss in text, right? Like, how do you discuss story structure on Facebook? That's a long conversation. Right? A long time, energy-consuming conversation. Whereas if we're just sitting down at a table or on Skype or wherever, we can actually talk about these things much faster, much easier. Yeah. So how have you grown as a result of keeping, community with other writers? Where do you think you would be if you were just working alone or, felt isolated? For me, there's a couple things. It's knowing what resources are out there. Just figuring out, like, what books do you read on story structure? What books do you read on this? Or what did you think about, this course or this method? So that's one thing, is the resources. The other thing is their writing process has been really enlightening, like learning how people edit their work, how they write their work. And then the third thing is just productivity, right? For me, at least, as a fairly competitive person, seeing other people produce quickly encourages me to do more. right? And just having the community, like even something as simple as, having a writing accountability partner or a writing buddy to do sprints with, even if you're online and you're just like, okay, 15 minutes, start the timer, go, and you compare word counts. It's just motivating having somebody else to hold you accountable. So it makes me more productive. It makes me a better writer. It makes me look at other alternatives. Like, and I think a lot of writers, they take the literature for like the rule of law, like, oh, this is the way you edit. This is the way you write a story, or it has to be this way. And then once you start talking to people, you realize that there are other ways to do things. You don't have to do things that way. Everybody has their own process. Everybody has their own ways. And learning what other people are doing has really helped me experiment and try new things and figure out what works for me. But if I were left to my own devices, I probably just would have, spun in circles for a while.
Right. It's easy to do that. Yeah.
It is. Yeah, especially when you don't know what else is out there, right? If you don't know what any alternative is, are you ever going to find it? Like those sorts of things took humans like centuries to figure out. So we built off the collective knowledge of what these people have done. So yeah, those three things.
Good.
Definitely.
Those are good.
Definitely.
Yeah. Anything you would add to that, Robert?
I would concur with exactly what Matt said. I think also from both technology and practices and changes in the platforms, you can't beat the independent community for staying up to date because, what worked 3 months ago may not work now. Right. And what works for one person, as Matt says, doesn't work for others. And that's also in the marketing and business sense. From the podcast point of view, both doing this one with you, Alida, and then prior to that doing the split with Brian Cohen, I think it's made me far more analytical about the craft of writing. How much that's flowed through to my own writing. That would be for readers to say, but I hope that it has made a big. I'm certain it's made a huge difference. I'm certain it's tightened everything up.
Right.
I've become a much better editor, a self-editor, because of that. And it was really interesting doing a year of reviewing young adult bestsellers with Brian and we did it two ways. We did it from a reader's perspective with some takeaways, and then we did it from a writer's perspective with some takeaways. And that was really, really interesting, trying to figure out, what was it that made this story take off. And sometimes I became known as Snobbert because because I was very snobby about some things. I just couldn't believe, how did this get through the editors? This is terrible, So, and it just shows you. It started to make me realize that this is a real hit and miss industry, and the independent community has kind of said, well, look, you've just got to keep at it and play the long game, and if you're willing to play with genre, if you're willing to play with style, find your own voice, but just keep it up, and you probably can make a success of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very different world to, as you were saying, writing the manuscript, sending it off in the stamped addressed envelope, and fingers.
Right.
Yeah.
waiting for those replies to come back, 6 months later. Yes.
Which still takes persistence, just of a different kind.
Yes. Yeah. Persistence and patience, definitely. It's interesting. Both of you mentioned keeping up on information and technology, and I think that's a huge positive of the digital community, but it can also be a negative because there's a point of overload. For me, at least, it gets to be too much coming at me, and then to try to stay on top of it and follow it. And I just want sort of like a clearinghouse. Like I want one trusted clearinghouse to go like, here's what you need to know, and this is it. Just like streamline everything.
Here's an interesting thing. On January the 26th, Facebook's algorithms, where they made all these huge changes, and Zuckerberg said, we're going to make your newsfeed more relevant to you, blah 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 blah, load of rubbish. But anyway, I used to get email notifications, and they stopped overnight.
Right.
And I've not had a single email notification since, which is really annoying on one hand, but on the other hand, I don't spend anywhere near as much time on Facebook as I used to, because you'd see an email come in with someone sort of posing some questions. Oh, yeah, I can answer that, or oh, I wonder what's people going to say about that one. And like you say, Matt, the amount of noise when you've got 20,000 people in the 20 books to 50K group, for example.
So much noise.
Oh,
right.
So it's been interesting that was like the slow boil of the frog. I didn't realize quite how much that was affecting me. So it's still lovely to have it as a resource, but you've got to be careful, say, Alida, how it can be very overwhelming, both from a point of view of, oh my God, Amazon's just changed all these things, I've got to now go and republish all my books.
Yes.
Well, maybe you do, maybe you don't. Or all these people are doing cover changes, I need to do a cover change. And there's that whole author shiny thing.
Right.
And yet, on the other hand, it is extremely useful for keeping up with stuff. So you've got to be really picky, and that's tough.
Right, and that is kind of the information sharing side of community. But I think the really valuable community is the interpersonal community, the stuff like the podcast, whether it's digital or a meetup or an intimate writing group you've been visiting, attending for years or whatever format that takes. That's where we really get to connect with each other and plug in, as Matt was saying, that human connection, the face-to-face thing that's lacking digitally is just so valuable, and for me it comes down to a lot of the craft stuff, because that's what I like to share and process and examine and talk about. And then also, there were years like when I was an at-home mom and my husband wasn't a creative person, and so to write a book I was really alone
on your own.
So there were years of feeling like I was in a little bubble, and I had friends who might be interested for a minute or two to hear about a story, but it wasn't their passion. So when you can connect with other writers, find that writing group or that digital whatever, it allows for sort of an expansion of artistry, of creativity and process, and, just clears some of that isolation out of what it takes to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Social media can definitely be like a fire hose of information, right? You got to figure out how to filter it. And like anthropologists and psychologists have done all this research about how like the typical human tribe is like up to 100 people, and beyond that it's just like faceless. But what's nice about having these communities online to pick from is you can go into this 20,000 person community and find the people who you most resonate with. Like maybe like you want to talk about craft with somebody, go find a couple people from that community and pick them out and make your smaller subset community. That's I mean, for to the credit of 20 books to 50K, Michael Anderley's community, what they've been really good about is breaking off into the subset communities. So like I know that there's like an Austin group that broke off from that community, or even from like the Smarter Artist communities. Like I met a bunch of people and it became like, smaller and smaller into like this small community. So I think everybody kind of like self-sorts into their own communities based on their interests. But you have to be careful with the fire hose of information, not to let it overwhelm you. You got to figure out how to do this. And this is not just a problem in writing communities. It's a problem with social media in general, right? It amplifies everything, and there's no off button. I've seen through this year, I've seen a lot of writers talk about how their productivity has gone down because they didn't know how to moderate their intake of politics. They were so, and writers as very like people that care a lot about culture and a lot about what's going on in the world, because that inspires them, and just that they're very empathetic, caring people. A lot of the times it can get overwhelming if you don't know how to moderate that. So figuring out what your strengths and weaknesses are, and for me at least, turning off the notifications. Like I don't use push notifications on my phone. I edit the notification settings on those groups so that they're not pinging me all the time. Figuring out like what your balance is definitely a thing, and I think that there's a danger of overwhelm. But if you can moderate that, then it can be a great resource. Just don't let it take over your life.
Right. And I think that's, a really good takeaway for people is that if you are looking for a community, if you don't currently have one, you could go somewhere like the 20 to 50, because we keep using that as an example. You could go somewhere like Facebook, enter a large group with the intention of finding your subset and be willing to test out several until you get to that place of community. My tendency personally is when I get overwhelmed is to just stop and leave that, back away, can't deal with it. But I don't
think most people have your self-discipline.
Well, even I could say, okay, I'm entering the fray with this purpose in mind, and then I can sort of consciously choose what I'm looking for. Okay, I'm looking for this kind of subgroup or this kind of conversation or this kind of individual, and then you can message and say, so you can get to the community even if you're starting in complete isolation.
Yeah, and especially for people who live in rural areas too, it's really nice, because if there's not like a writing community in your area, it doesn't mean you can't access one.
Right.
Whether it's Facebook groups or forums or blogs, a lot of people have, smaller communities now. Gotta find them.
Definitely. Well, we are going to wrap this up. So this podcast, Matt, Catherine, and Robert, this has been an amazing source of community for me. Coming and talking craft roughly every week. We publish every week. We don't record every week, is one of the highlights of my writing life. So thank you. And I hope our listeners feel a little fondness for what we're doing, feel a little sense of community here as well.
Absolutely.
Totally. And thank you for involving me.
Of course. Our pleasure.
Yeah. Ditto. I've learned a lot from you in particular, Alida, but also talking to you and Catherine for sure. For sure.
Well, that is it for this week's show. And head over to Facebook. Let us know what kind of community you're involved in, and say hello to each other. We've got the Storyworks Writers Facebook group. It's a great way to find some community. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.